All right, this is a piece that I eventually titled Spotlight. I didn't have a title for it when I actually started it, but the light just really suggested that title to me as this piece developed. This was a pencil drawing, started as a pencil drawing done on a sketchbook. I took that into Photoshop and added the light to it, added the value to that linear pencil drawing, and then printed that out on archival paper, mounted that down to Masonite using matte medium, and that's how we prep this thing for paint. Now, sometimes we'll use acrylics to build the value a little more quickly at the beginning phase if I've not built the value digitally. But I knew this piece, it was going to take me a little time to work some things out, so I just went right into it with the oil. And this is, using one of my favorite underpainting palettes, which is black. I usually stick with Mars Black, but you could use Ivory Black. I would just be careful. You don't really have to be careful of anything, but be aware that the Ivory Black is definitely going to cool it down a little more. So the Ivory Black, the Burnt Umber, Raw Sienna, and White. So I have this, I'm sure, loaded with liquid also, liquid and thinner at this phase. So I'm kind of just using a little more of the oil to do the preliminary work in this piece than I have in some of the other pieces lately. But I really wanted to establish a very strong light that he was just sticking his beak out into. Everything else in this thing was going to be in some kind of a half light. Some of that is actually a reflected light from the foreground that's in light, and we get into that a little bit more later, but that foreground is being hit by the same light that is hitting his face. So these are all decisions and ideas that I made after I had the pencil drawing done. I didn't really think about any of that in just designing the dragon. The dragon was just a pretty forward dragon with a bunch of scales and fins and things. So with the underpainting, I'm actually going to start to define more of the anatomy of this dragon as far as texture and form, because my goal and my thought on this particular piece was that a lot of the early color choices, which I still hadn't made as far as what color the dragon was going to be and things like that, I would be able to do them as a glaze and have a little more freedom once I got the drawing and the light established. So I was really, by going with a monochromatic palette, it really lets you focus on that with very little concern about the color at all. And I always like these warmer underpaintings because a little bit of that coming through the transparent oil paint just always warms it up for me a little bit. It always just makes things seem a little more alive somehow. So it's a great color as a base. So now at this point, having said all that, we're really down into just using that limited palette, about 4 or 5 tones on the palette. I do mix a color between white and the burnt sienna, especially when I'm painting something opaquely with those higher key colors like this, like the area in the face. So I have that on the palette, and I'm really just going in here and refining the drawing even further. And by drawing, I sort of mean the form, the draftsmanship of this dragon. The little different bumps and humps of the spine going backwards. You can see, where I might indicate what's going to be the pattern of scales, and getting some form on the horns and that kind of thing. But all through that, I want to be painfully aware that there is this lighted area of the dragon that is really not contaminated by the darker parts of the palette. It's the same object, but it's this object in direct light and then in shadow, essentially. Now, in shadow gets a little more complicated on the body and stuff because there's a reflected light. But at the beginning, I kind of try and look at it in a little more of a binary way. It's light and it's not light. And that helps me break down the values that I'm choosing on the palette for certain areas. And I have to say, and I've said this before, I do like noodling these little guys' faces. They're fun to work on. A lot can be changed pretty quickly when you're in this monochromatic phase, moving the eyes one way or the other, or making them larger or smaller. There's a lot of things that are very fluid at this point in the painting. So for me, it's really the thing coming to life, which is one of the most exciting parts of the process. Now, in the sketch, sometimes again, in the sketch, I'll work out more of the scale patterns and things, or at least have kind of form lines that indicate the mass and the volume of certain areas, like that deltoid muscle, that shoulder muscle there. And in this particular piece, I didn't. I left those things to be drawn in at this point. I was really focused on the head in the drawing. And there are things I've done before, but I'm getting an opportunity here to draw the thing more in full value and really get this arm, a lot closer in value to finish than I would have in the pencil drawing. And since I've done this quite a few times, I felt pretty confident that I could draw my way through this without having resolved it in the pencil stage. Now this reflected light back into, this is a light which you'll see the foreground a little bit more here in a little while when we back out, but it's as lit as the dragon's face. So the body, the chest, and the shoulders are really being just lit from underneath. It's a reflected light of that real direct light hitting the foreground and then bouncing back at these scales. It's something I've always found it to be an interesting effect. It's something that the Hildebrands used to do to great effect, and it's one of the few pieces that I've used this light arrangement in. So that was something that was really neat for me to play with. And again, everything is loaded with liquid. So in between these sittings on this piece, everything is completely dry. Everything's completely dry when I start again. So I get to some points where I'm happy with some of the detail, and there's sometimes I'll just soften it down and know that I'm going to go back into that area. I'm kind of setting it up for the next pass. Now, as we get into the lower portions of it there, I wasn't sure how I was going to deal with the transitions, and I wasn't even sure what I was going to do with the background when I first started this thing. Although I did sort of feel like a cave was a good environment. I enjoy it. It always feels natural to me, and it feels it feels like a great habitat for these guys. So again, it's just more refinement of the drawing while I'm still in essentially the monochromatic palette. The palette's easy to mix every day, what little mixing there is, so it's easy to reproduce. So I pretty much figured I was going to go with like a greenish color. I was going to at least start with that, and if I made some sort of iridescent quality with this guy, or I changed the color and I put a pattern on him or something, that would be fine. But I wanted to go with something pretty natural. And I thought that the reddish background, the perfect device to push some visual impact is always a complement. So we've got kind of a red and a green thing going on here. Now, of course, green, I've talked about this before, is an interesting color because as you get into the highlights of green, it can start to turn yellow. It's really not green anymore, but that's important in having the impact of that light, having that highlight area be a little more yellow. So here's where, you can see that the time I put into underpainting the lower body with the more full value starts to serve a purpose with these green just glazes. It really starts to take the piece. I wouldn't call it finished, but I can really see now how I'm going to finish some of these things. So now the green is wet and has a medium in it. So I'm able to work these more opaque whites right into that. And the paint starts to become opaque. I'm essentially, working it wet into wet, these transparent darks, and using these more opaque middle tones and highlights to build to finish, the layer of opacity and oil paint that I'm trying to achieve in these things, which is sort of a combination of some areas more transparent, and usually it's the subject area that becomes more opaque and a little more rendered. One of the things about this light hitting the wing now at this point is because of the glazes that I had done on the face, I established the palette that's there, not through mixing that palette at first, but by, painting it in the monochromatic and then glazing the green into it more. Now that I've established that as really the color, what I did was I went back and actually mixed from the painting itself and created those colors to work into the wings in the background now. So the painting had kind of had showed me what to do with the palette there. It took a little experimentation to see, what I liked and what I didn't like. And again, now that there's some color going on in these wings and stuff, I wouldn't call them finished, but I can go back in and work on these stalactites and stalagmites in a way that I think I will be able to take it to finish now, where before I hadn't really done that because I knew I was going to glaze color over the underpainting of the dragon himself, and the edges may just get a little, I may run over. I tend to move quickly. I know I always save that final stage on that subject for later, in this case being the dragon's head and all these horns. So I want to get the background brought to finish before I'm going to finish the head, obviously. I mean, it just makes sense to kind of work that way. But I did need to establish some things just so I knew what I was trying to do. And this is where the rubber kind of hits the road with that. I'm able to really get in here now and get some finish, all but just a few brush strokes, it'll just be a few brush strokes away, this background, from finish after this pass. And you can see, like, now the palettes start to break apart a little bit, where the object, being the dragon, is a little more green. There's, I don't take the background as dark, even though this does have some fairly darks in the background, but I have a tendency to kind of artificially introduce an aerial perspective in my pieces, and my hope is that brings a focus to things by allowing the distant elements to be a little lighter many of the times, and it lets me put a little more contrast in that subject element. That's just something from painting, paperback covers and doing illustration work for so many years, but it's a technique to reinforce the focus on your subject, which in this case, I mean, it's not just the dragon. To me, the subject in this is the dragon's head. So things like the wings, they're really almost like I think of them as like a middle ground in this piece as far as the palette. So you have the distant cave wall or whatever, the formations, whatever you want to call them. Then the wings are next, and then of course the head. And in this case, we even have the head with that light connects to the foreground a little bit too, which we haven't seen a lot of yet, but we will here shortly. But now you can see it, I'll go around and work those darks now that I have the cave laid in around him. And it lets me blend for right now where I want to blend, or soften an edge or change an edge, change the drawing of it slightly. And if I really want to put in something sharp on the dragon, and I know that I do go over this dragon, I think at least 2 more times to really get the value where I want it. But my point is that there's plenty of time for finish there on him. And of course, I'm always flipping these things every which way. And I mean, that just helps me with brush direction, breaking up the brush direction so that everything doesn't feel like it's, like it's a driving rain. All your brush strokes are going in one direction. And now here, by this point, the palette is pretty well established. And, I really like the way the dragon even goes to like a reddish violet in the darkest shadows, but then that turns to the green. And it's just, it's an interesting combination of color for me. It's not one I've used a lot. But I am happy with how this piece turned out, and I think the color combination really worked. Now here's where I've got these wings and stuff kind of laid in. I wouldn't call them finished, but I realized that I really want the edges of some of this piece to fade away into the dark. So I start to work the darks in the background again. So I kept heightening and working on this area. And this is like one of those things that if you're doing something digitally, I mean, you can put up a color dodge layer over something like this and just create it without any of this sort of thought or understanding of what the value needs to be. The computer can give you the answers in areas like this. So it's definitely a little different and a little more, a little more thought goes into it when you're doing this traditionally. And again, here, I had kind of started to bring that horizon down and lighten it originally because I thought the contrast between the lit foreground and something real dark behind it, I didn't necessarily want a real hard edge there at first, but I came to the conclusion that I did want to actually harden that up a little bit. And again, that's more because, I mean, the values in this piece, it does have a big range of them from the area. If you compare the highlight area to the shadow area, but when you look at just the shadow area, for example, the values are very bracketed. So I was able to tighten that up even more here as I go. Now, again, I started work on these things and I try and, it's not that my goal is to leave them loose, but it's okay to leave them loose until you get something established that you feel comfortable with moving forward. Now, here was a case where the plates going down this dragon's neck looked a little off to me. And even though I had spent all the time on that underpainting and all that, sometimes this happens. You get down the road and it still just doesn't quite get there. So I have, again, models and different things in the studio that I was able to look at just to give me a little glimpse of how this texture and how this form might work with a reflected light of this nature. And I was able to change the direction of some of that. And I think it really enhanced not only the form looking more correct, but the perspective of the shoulders coming forward and some things like that. Now again, here's where the dragon at this point, now you can see we've got the anatomy pretty much straightened out as far as where the muscles are and that kind of thing. But he still really doesn't have any scales or anything. So that's the time to deal with it for me, because I know that now the underlying form and volume and the musculature is all what I want it to be. So now laying scales on top of that, it's just easier when you're not trying to fight the form there. So now I'm in again, I've mixed a few colors, a palette to go over this, and it does have some darks that aren't present in the dragon so far. And it lets me push that, even a little further in there. And you can see how, I'll lay them in and they look really more well defined than I want some of these things to be at first. They're too dark or whatever, and then I'll go in and kind of dust them down a little. And that is, it's a great method. Then you go back in and work out a few highlights and a few edges as you go, but you're not repainting the whole thing, every time. It's sort of a kind of a corrective process, I've called it in the past. And I'm being careful, even though I'm adding these highlights, that these really are sort of middle tones on the palette for one thing, but they're highlights in this area, and I want to keep them really in the middle of the value bracket because I want to make it obvious that these are in the shadow, and when we see the area of the dragon in light compared to this will still seem pretty dark. Working on the wing, like back here, there's, you can see the little shapes that I kind of draw over and make them more obvious, but the paint lay-in almost suggests some of that to me. And it's great when that all kind of works together like that. But you'll also be able to see in this area now that I was talking about earlier, where the value of the whole thing across the background right behind the foreground now is a much more bracketed, muted, dark set of values. And the area I'm talking about specifically is where the dragon ends right behind the foreground line there. It had a much greater definition to it earlier in the piece, and that really just had to be knocked down into a big shadow. And again, through a lot of this, and this on the face as well, which we'll see here in a little bit, this is really putting in the time. These are the rendering. This is the time to put the detail in that you want into it, because at this point we're confident that the color and the anatomy, is all what we want it to be. So now is the time to get in there and spend the time rendering different things. And you can see here, I kind of move around. I move my brush around as I'm sort of thinking about this face, but I'm really aware that I don't want to turn that very nicely lit area into a middle tone by adding too much of these dark secondary details with the scaling and stuff. So I really bracketed the palette and tried to be as aware of that as I could while I was working on this area. And it's in, the transition here on the forehead where you really can tell, where you can really see, or at least you're aware of when I was painting it, all of the color and that's in this piece, from green to red, violet, and yellow. It's always interesting to me how many colors it takes sometimes to paint an object that's, green, for example, or any color. There can be so many subtle deviations in it. Now, I wasn't sure what I was going to do for the eyes here, but I wanted to start to establish some of the real darkest darks in this piece. And again, I've saved these, for around the mouth and the nostrils and the eyes, because I view the head as the subject even more specifically than the dragon itself. So I really want to have a major amount of contrast there, more so than anywhere else. I wasn't sure if I was going to have them lit from the inside or if these were going to be big wet eyes, all that kind of thing. I had a few choices, but I was kind of just playing around with some different things at this point, knowing that whatever I did here would be dry the next morning, and I could, if I didn't like it, I could work it out. But while I was there working on this face, I knew I could play around with it a little bit. That little highlight, makes it look wet, that nice wet orb of an eyeball. So I was just trying to get a taste for, what I might do there. Ultimately, my decision was to go with something that reminded me more of like the eye of like a rodent. It is a red eye, but it's not, to me, it's not a glowing red eye so much. It's just, it seemed that from being like this kind of underground dweller, it would have that sort of attribute. Now I work on this for a little while, and I laid in this color. Now rocks can be a little tricky sometimes. There's something that sometimes you lay these things in and they look great right away, and that's when that happens, you thank your lucky stars, and it's Miller time. But it didn't happen here. This was one that I wound up fighting a little bit. So I laid it in a little, thinking I might be able to pull this out, and I just wasn't happy with where it was going. So I did a little reference search, and that really helped me confidently paint this foreground, because one of my concerns was that if I tried to render my way out of it, it would become too tight. And it really, while it is a contrasty area, I don't want it to detract from the dragon's head. So now here we are back just in the head quickly though, and you can see now where I'm really splitting some hairs with the high middle tones, and adding in a more opaque yellow. I know I've said this before, but I love Naples yellow. I'm sure I did have some CAD on the palette for this too, because those real high highlights or something, cadmium yellow and white just looks like light in the tube. So this is the place to use those kind of things. And the trick that's always interesting about rendering these these things like this, is there is a point where too much detail starts to look artificial. I've talked about this in different ways before. Sometimes patterns being too strong in something or too mathematical. The rendering of things is also something that I'm always aware of. There is a point where over rendering it starts to detract from the reality of it, at least for me. And so that's just a balance I try and strike. I think it's a personal thing, and definitely a personal choice, but it's something I'm aware of when I'm working on something like the face, because you could get in there and do a billion little scales, but I don't know that it would add anything to it. And again, that's a personal, that's a choice. That's a stylistic choice. So then, we're in here trying to just refine this mouth a little more, the tongue, the teeth. Again, the teeth are, they're arguably whitish. I'm sure they're yellowed, but we're showing them as a pretty dark middle tone gray. So again, really stating obviously that there is a palette in light and there is a palette in shadow. Okay, so back to the foreground here now. Here you can see that I start making some moves when I start painting with big brushes, and it feels like, sometimes I know what I'm doing, but it feels more like I know what I'm doing at this point. And in this case, that's true, because I did find some reference that I liked, and I was able to, again, I'm not painting a portrait of that reference necessarily, but I may look at different passages of it to combine in a new composition or whatever. But what I'm able to get out of it is the way the light is hitting these shapes, and then going in and adding a little bit of detail at the end is a little bit more of a drawing exercise. But right now it was really just about establishing the form of these things in a confident way that made sense. But my concern was also not to paint them so tightly that it detracted from the dragon. I was looking for something, I've said this before, but almost like I've compared it to plein air painting. It's something that I want to look very spontaneous, but also to have a realistic quality to it, but an area that the brushwork is a little more dominant. And even in the lay-in, as I was doing that there, you can see little bits of green, little bits of grass and stuff. And I noticed that in some of the reference, and I chose it for that. And it was a way to not completely eliminate the green that I had a little while ago, and just bring that color down into this foreground area, and use it around the piece a little bit more. I think it really helped homogenize the whole piece a little bit, where, it all feels now like it's in the same environment, the same light. And again, the rocks, this is a personal choice, how finished you want to make these things. One of the things I use as a guide, I've said this before, I've recommended this before, but I have several mirrors set up, and I'll look at the piece over my shoulder at the mirror that's hanging on the wall behind me. And if I'm working on it and nothing seems to change in that view, then I'm just in there noodling detail for my own personal satisfaction. It's not really changing the piece as far as, in my opinion, the viewer's concerned. So that's a point where I generally start to look to call it done. What am I really in here doing is what I start to ask myself. Now, here I'm still trying to add some smaller detail to this. So I'm in here now with a round. Now this piece is 8.5 by 11, so it's a pretty small painting to begin with. So even detail brushes, a brush like this that would normally be a detail brush for me, can be something that you can use in a nice little loose way to just drag around and add that extra little bit of finish. Painting the grass was another area. While I am adding little brush strokes there, it becomes more about the brush handling than actually painting every blade of grass. That's something I'm trying to stay away from at that point. But I think it turned out pretty well, and there we go. Spotlight. And you can see why we wound up with that name. And of course, as always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments, and I'd be happy to try and answer them. Thank you for listening, and if you've gotten this far, please consider joining my Patreon if you haven't already. There are 3 options in joining my Patreon: the Red Drake tier, which has exclusive Patreon supporter-only content; the Silver Wyvern tier, which has exclusive content as well as an art print of that month's dragon art; and the Gold Dragon tier, which includes video critiques of your work. I hope you'll join this Dragon Lovers community, where I'll be sharing many insightful tips to hopefully improve your dragon art making abilities. Thank you again. We'll see you next time.